Porpoising has been one of the hottest topics in car development in F1 this year. And in this two-part video series, we're going to talk about why porpoising exists and how the new rules for 2022 have resulted in porpoising occurring when it didn't previously. For those of you that are new to my channel, I was an aerodynamicist for Mercedes for the 2018, 19 and 20 Formula 1 season. I now work as an aerodynamics consultant designing aero kits for race cars all around the world. Now, I wasn't actually originally planning to do any videos on porpoising because, quite frankly, there's so many unknowns around the current porpoising phenomena and what we have as information available to us. Porpoising is a very complex situation, and I didn't want to oversimplify it, particularly as I don't have access to all the instrumentation and data that the teams would have on the inside. However, the reason I am making this video is because I saw so many explanations coming out there of porpoising that were either just wrong, massively oversimplified, or seemed to miss the mark. And I figured that even though my explanation is not going to be perfect, it's hopefully going to be one of the better ones out there. Now, this first part of this video series will be talking about the mechanisms behind porpoising, both from an aerodynamic and a bit from the mechanical perspective. And then the second video will be talking about the regulations in terms of what they've done to trigger porpoising on the cars. To make this video a little bit easier to follow, I've done a basic CFD analysis of a representative 2022 F1 car, and we're going to talk through that as well as talk about some of the more fundamental mechanisms behind porpoising. So anyway, let's get into it. Now, to start off with, we have to talk about ground effect. Now, the easiest way to explain what happens with ground effect is to talk about an airfoil or wing to start with. So if you imagine, we have our airfoil sitting here. It's sitting in free air. So that will mean that we have suction below it and we have pressure above it. Now, if we go and put it in close proximity to a ground plane, the effective suction below the wing is increased. This makes the wing more powerful as it interacts with the ground. However, if we get too close to the ground, let's say we move our ground plane up very tight to the wing like that, what can happen is the wing can suffer flow separation, and this flow separation here reduces the ability of the wing to generate suction. So if we get very close to the ground, there'll be a region where we're not generating as much suction than if we are a little bit further away from the ground. The most extreme case of this is obviously if the ground plane touches the wing, because if that happens, then no air can get past that point. So there's no air going past here. So therefore, the wing can only generate the suction from the pressure on top, plus some residual suction effects down the bottom. Now, if we drew a graph of that in terms of this bottom axis being our ride height, and this vertical axis being our downforce, what would happen is we'd have a plot that would look something like this. We're gaining downforce as we get closer and closer to the ground. We get too close to the ground, the wing starts to get flow separation, and it tapers off. Something like that. Not exactly, and it will vary for each wing, but this is roughly what we're talking here. And that's the basics of how ground effect at extremely close proximity will work for something like an airfoil. Now let me go and spice it up a notch for you. So what I'm going to draw is I'm going to draw a few different geometries. So we have here our standard airfoil. We have here, I'll go and have a multi-element airfoil. And what I'll have finally is I'll have an airfoil that has some form of end plate or skirt that goes down to the ground. And what I'll do with each one of these is I'll just draw a representative ground plane in there so you can kind of picture what's going on. Now, if I now draw my same ride height downforce plot as before, and let's say that this option is blue, this option is red, and this option is purple, then what we're going to have is the blue option is going to be more or less as we defined before. So we go up, we have our downforce decrease as we start to get our wing flow separation and stall. Then on our red option, what we'll have is we'll probably have a little bit less downforce to start with. As we go up, we'll come in a bit gentler, and you can see that we've got lots of slot gaps to allow air to blow through these bits here. So we could theoretically design an airfoil like this to always be increasing in downforce as we get closer and closer to the ground. We then have our final option, which is in purple, and that's going to be limited by the proximity of the end plate to the ground, and that will create a curve that may be a little bit more nonlinear because we're still going to be producing high amounts of downforce, and then we might have right at the bottom depending on the design, we could end up having some instability or some vortex issues with the end plate, and that could then cause a bit of a drop off at the top. It will probably still end up higher than these other designs. So what you can see from this is that we have varying downforce characteristics as we get near to the ground. And it's important to note that for the third case, the purple line, I can hit my end plate on the ground and still make a decent amount of downforce because I still have essentially a tunnel underneath. And it's the third case that's closest to a modern F1 car. The main gist I wanted you to get though is that depending on the geometry we have here, we can have different levels of downforce as we approach the ground, and we can have different levels of response as we get deep into the ground proximity. So now that we've got these curves, we have to think about what's actually causing the porpoising. Well, in the case that we have a downforce curve that goes up and then back down, what happens is that as our car goes faster and faster, our suspension compresses more and more. So we get to lower and lower ride heights. Remember, this bottom axis is ride height. So if we start going along at a normal speed around here, and then where suspension is compressing and compressing and compressing, we're going to get more and more downforce. Now, naturally, if you look at this curve and you're a team trying to work out where you want to run the car, you would really want to run the car so that it's in this sort of region of peak downforce. You want to maximize the downforce on the car. So let's say we're going to try and push it as far to the high end as possible. Or if we have a downforce curve that's going off and never drops off, we're going to try and push it as far along that area as we think we can get away with without the car bottoming out all over the place. Now, this gives us two different scenarios. One is on the purple curve, where what can happen is that if we're riding in this particular scenario here, and let's say we've just gotten a bit out of the window, or there's been a bump that's compressed the suspension a little bit more, and we've ended up over here, what we'll see is a reduction in downforce in this particular region, and this reduction in downforce will mean that the springs will now be under less load, they'll go to expand, and that will push us to move back over here. Now, of course, if we're down here and we moved up to just say here, we could have potentially more downforce than we had at the lower ride height. Now, what this would mean is that as we move up in ride height, we get more downforce, and this would then force us to go back down again. So basically what happens is we go down here, we lose a bit of downforce, that causes our suspension to uncompress, which puts us back to this point, which causes us to gain downforce, which causes us to go back to the low ride height, and thus you have an oscillation, which is basically going to give you porpoising. Of course, in this particular scenario, I've only included the effects of the suspension in terms of just the spring. But let's think a little bit more about the fact that suspension, generally speaking, has a bump stop. Now, that can be either in the form of the car literally hitting the track and bottoming out, or you can have a bump stop earlier, which is generally what you do so that the car isn't slamming into the track surface. Now, this brings me to the B line, where we have designed a car that always produces more downforce the lower it gets. Now, what happens here is that as you get to a certain ground proximity, you're going to start increasing your downforce more and more and more. So the car's going to be making more and more downforce, and eventually it's going to build up some vertical velocity. That's going to mean that, let's say we put our bump stop here, the car's going to be moving downwards at quite some pace by the time it gets to here. It's getting more and more force added by the downforce. It's going to hit the bump stop quite hard. And so what can actually happen is that you can have the bump stop basically act like a very high spring rate spring and basically bounce the car back off there. So it bounces off the bump stop and goes back up. It shoots back up. Immediately it's got enough downforce that it wants to compress again because it's now no longer in the bump stop range. It's now in the spring range, and therefore it goes up. So if you imagine that we just had a basic spring, and we had a rod through there, some form of damper, and some form of spring around here like that, what you'll have is you'll have some bump stop there like that. And so we'll compress until we hit our bump stop along here. The bump stop has a much higher spring rate than the spring. That forces it to go compress because it's got velocity, and then the kinetic energy of the velocity is shot back at it, so it expands again, and that kicks it up off the bump stop. It's on the softer spring. The downforce forces it back onto the bump stop. The other part of this is that your damping rate often isn't as position sensitive as your bump stop is. So as your shock is compressing, when it gets to hit that bump stop, your damping doesn't just massively shoot through the roof. So your damping has to match your spring rate. The bump stop has a very high spring rate, but it doesn't necessarily have a high damping rate. So therefore, any oscillations won't be very well damped for how high the spring rate of the bump stop is. Obviously, you can add some things like position-sensitive damping to try and solve this, but it's always a bit of a tricky area to cover. And this is how you can have a scenario where aerodynamically your car should be fine from porpoising, but mechanically it won't be. So at this point, we can see that we can either introduce porpoising from an undesirable aerodynamic characteristic, or we can have it from an undesirable mechanical characteristic. The next part of the puzzle is something known as hysteresis. And basically what this is when your aerodynamics aren't the same on the way up as they are on the way down. So I can have a car that I test, and it's got an aerodynamic characteristic that goes something like this. So the downforce is dropping off there. And then what will happen is that will be the characteristic when I go down. But once I get flow separation around this bottom point down here, if I'm going back up, it can actually have a downforce characteristic that goes along like this, or perhaps a slight slope, and then it only jumps up to the higher level of downforce at a much higher height. So this is known as hysteresis, and it is a real aerodynamic phenomenon that is associated with flow separation. Now, if you imagine our scenario from before, if we have the car set up here, and let's say our suspension compresses this way, and we have a separation over here, then our downforce level is actually still really low, while the springs, which we used all this energy here to push down where we had more downforce, the springs are holding all that, but now we've had the downforce release. So what's happened is that it's more or less, it's stalled, it's dropped down here. We've got less downforce available, but there's nothing resisting the spring from popping back up. So the spring pops back up on the suspension, the downforce still isn't resisting it, and then all of a sudden, your hysteresis ends, your flow reattaches, and now you have a massive increase in downforce. So big hysteresis going on. This massive increase of downforce is then trying to force your car back down again really hard. So this is another way in which porpoising could potentially occur. So these are the fundamentals of mechanically how porpoising occurs, but let's have a look at how this happens from a flow and aerodynamic perspective. Now this CFD model that I've got here to discuss the aerodynamics that are going on requires a little bit of a preamble and some explanation. First things first, the model is based off a AR leak from Alfa Romeo. I've then applied some automated smoothing to it to make it so that it's a little bit more tolerable, because the model that came from that leak was extremely tessellated. So I had to smoothen it out a bit just so everything was a tiny bit more realistic, but it's still got a lot of issues with it, particularly around shedding edges and things like that. Any sort of angled steps like these jagged bits along the side here are all quite rounded off. Now, the geometry on that particular model is very clearly from a pre-launch spec. It's a much earlier spec of the car that we never really got to see. So all the details are off, a lot of the geometries are off, and because I was just doing a quick and dirty CFD, my contact patch sizings are very off. You can have a look that I've got too much squash on the front tire and too little on the rear. So all that combined together, it's a very dodgy CFD, just very quickly run. And the reason why I'm still showing it, even with all these assumptions, like a driver removed, for example, is just for illustrative purposes, so that people who perhaps can't understand what airflow looks like intuitively can actually have a bit of an idea as to what's going on. Now, what we're looking at here is a pressure map over the car of static pressure. And in the free stream, what we're visualizing with this volume render is flow energy. So you can see like that's an area of low energy coming off the wake. We've got a low energy region up top at the back. You can see the wheel wakes coming along there. So anyway, when it comes to porpoising, the key thing that we're really going to look at is the area that is in close proximity to the ground. So that is the underside. And I think that this geometry is architecturally resembling what's on a 22 F1 car quite nicely. We've got several floor strakes at the front which produce a vortex that goes along underneath the floor. You can see the loss in the core of the vortex just going along there like that. We have suction at the front around where the strakes are kicking out. We have suction at the diffuser kick at the rear, and we have suction along the sidewall of the diffuser kick there, where we have the vortices from the back portion of the diffuser moving around there. Now, one of the interesting things about the rule set is that the forward strake areas actually are raised. You can see that they're lifted off the ground there, and then that angles back to a flattened portion at the rear. And if you have a look at how these cars have been porpoising, it's all been coming from the rear of the car more so than the front of the car. And that's because we've got a whole area along here that's in close ground proximity, and we also have a big suction peak along the bottom here. We also have some expansion in the middle of the car along the center line there, which contributes to the suction peak along the bottom here. You'll note my particular model is missing the plank, which changes the game a little bit, but you get the rough gist. The real cars also have a very small set of vortex generators along the boat, just here. But what I really want you to pay attention to is the bit along here where we have the corner vortices and the edge vortices of the floor come in underneath the diffuser's main body along here. Now I've cut sort of in the middle of these vortices so that we can get a clearer look without so much noise around it, but you'll see that we have a very lossy structure coming off the corner of this particular junction. Now this particular CFD setup I've used, I know over predicts the loss, so in real life it's not going to be as bad as this, but you can start to see that we have the beginnings of a problem going on here with respect to a vortex that's trying to break down. And I'll show you it in 2D slices in a little bit. But what you can actually see going on is you can just see very faintly there's a vortex structure along here that gets fed in from the floor edge. That goes along there, and then we have secondary structures and loss coming off this edge of this foot plate here. Now it's an interesting balance here because what we have is we have a floor edge that is really low to the ground. So we know that lowering that is going to improve our effective, I guess you could almost call it sealing to the ground for the main tunnel. So that should improve the suction in this central area. And we also have a rear fence along the side of the diffuser that as it gets closer to the ground, it's going to keep out the tire squirt from entering the diffuser. So we know that as we drop the rear of these cars, we're going to get more and more performance. However, we can see that we're getting these vortices lossier and lossier. And when we get really close, you can imagine that these side edge vortices are going to get very lossy indeed. Now what I've got here to show you the point a bit better is some slices along the car. So there's the bodywork, and we're moving downstream along there. So this is what we've got here is this is the floor edge, this is the back of the diffuser junction, and what you'll see is just down in this bit down here, you'll see that we have the remnants of the vortex is actually coming from the floor edge further upstream, and then this particular purple ring there is actually the vortex, the lossy one that we saw at the corner of the system. Now if we look at how these evolve as we move further downstream, we can see we've got quite a lossy vortex, and we follow it further downstream, and you can see we've got this big amount of loss present in the diffuser tunnel. Now that particular loss will provide back pressure in the tunnel, which will cause the tunnel to lose suction. Now one thing that I also want to highlight here is you'll notice that the main roof of the tunnel along here never sees flow separation. And the particular design of the rules means that these tunnels have to sit quite high off the ground compared to the lower sides. And the kick that they can have in terms of the diffuser kick is actually only quite small. So a lot of people are talking about the diffuser getting flow blocked off or flow stalling on the roof. That's extremely unlikely because of the high ground clearance and the fact that this tunnel stays high the entire way to the front. The roof of the main tunnel is likely to always be attached. And so it's most likely some form of vortex breakdown phenomenon and transient vortex phenomenon. The only area where that could potentially not be the case is in the central plank region where it's really low to the ground, so there's a chance we get flow separation there. And to prove a point on this, I've prepared a low ride height case. We can see that on this low ride height case, you can see we have a much earlier breakdown of this vortex. You can see that we've got that big blob of loss really blowing up there. And then as we move further downstream, what you'll see is that we have a whole bunch of separation underneath the central boat region. So we've got all this loss here, and as we go downstream, you can see that that completely fills up the tunnel exit. Now, what I want to compare this to is I actually ran a higher ride height case again, so a much higher ride height. And you'll see that in this higher ride height case that we've got going on here, we can see the edge vortices and the corner vortices are comparatively very clean. They look quite clean as we move rearwards. We're letting in a lot more tire weight down the bottom, but we've got cleaner vortices and a cleaner roof there. If we look at the low ride height case by comparison, So we can see this is at the corner now. So corner, low ride height, high, low, high, low, high. You can see massive difference in the loss along there. And we go further rearwards and we can see we've got a giant blow up in the low ride height. We're looking quite happy in the high ride height, but the low ride height is keeping the lower wake out nicely. The high ride height is not. We move further rearwards again, and we can see we've got two very different exit profiles at the back of the diffuser. Now, the real kicker in this story is actually the overall performance between these two cases. And if we have a look, we have this is the low ride height, and this is the high ride height. And you can see that even though we have those massive vortex problems in the low ride height case, we still have more downforce. This is a suction plot at the earlier portion of the kick as we move further rearward. So you can see that's the kick coming up. And you can see that we have more suction in the low ride height case, which immediately raises the point of where you would want to run the car. Because if I'm looking at this from a vehicle performance standpoint, I know that all my performance is down at the bottom of this ride height range. Even though I'm having problems with vortex blow up, I still want to target here. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was the exact thing that you saw in the wind tunnel. And when you see it about any interviews with any of the teams talking about porpoising, they're always talking about how the performance is all at the low ride height end of the spectrum, so they want to run the car there. And so even though the car's porpoising, it's still faster to run it at this lower end. It's because the performance is sitting there. And as I discussed before, this model is a little bit dodgy. We know that. We know the CFD on this model is also a little bit dodgy, so the specifics in real life are likely a bit different. And also, CFD is just not an accurate representation of the real world, because in the real world, you have transient effects going on. And the thing is that when you have a car that is bouncing up and down, that can induce transient oscillations in the form of dynamic stalls. In terms of off this lower foot plate down here, you can end up with a dynamic flow separation off the bottom of it, which could be feeding into a vortex and causing a breakdown. And also you can end up with things flexing around as well. So if we have a flexible floor at the edge and that starts to dip down, that could bring the edge of the floor into close contact with the ground. We could have some unforeseen loss, trigger a vortex breakdown further downstream. So there's a lot of complexity to this scenario, and you really don't want to oversimplify it too much because it's actually a far more complex problem than I think a lot of people give it credit for. And a lot of people like to say that you can just pinpoint one particular geometrical feature on the car and, oh, Mercedes' reason for porpoising is this kick in the diffuser, or Red Bull doesn't porpoise because it has an ice skate. In reality, you don't know that, and no one really does unless the team has fitted a specific test item and then gone from there. And as you can probably tell by how much the teams have been struggling with it, it's not a simple one to solve. Well, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Leave a comment below on what videos you'd like to see next from me, and hopefully, I'll see you next time.